There are many different types of exceptionality or special needs that children may have, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of information on this slide in terms of what you might be looking for. So you may encounter children with physical disabilities, and this could be neurological, musculoskeletal, or health concerns. So musculoskeletal would be things like cerebral palsy, health concerns are asthma and diabetes. Children may have mental retardation or cognitive issues, so this could be low IQ, and then adaptive issues would be just difficulty with kind of everyday tasks, self-care, figuring out how to do things that children who are typically developing may not struggle with. There may be learning disabilities, so oftentimes these are kids who have a normal or high IQ, but for some reason their achievement doesn't match up to the level of IQ that they have. So this could be test anxiety, this could be things like ADHD, this could be dyslexia. So it's not an IQ issue, it's an achievement issue. And then oftentimes we also see communicative disorders, so that may be speech or language issues, and then we will continue this discussion of types of exceptionality on the next slide. So other types of exceptionality or special needs include hearing impairments, so children might be completely deaf or just hard of hearing. There could be visual impairments or blindness, so visual impairments typically are children who are partially sighted, and then blindness is not being able to see at all. Children can have emotional or behavioral disorders. So these would be both externalizing and internalizing. So externalizing could be some of those challenging behaviors that we were talking about in the Play and Peers lecture, where children have been traumatized in some way and their behaviors are indicative of the trauma they've experienced, and they're yelling or fighting or doing more externalized kinds of things. And then internalizing emotional behavioral disorders would be things that impact generally only the person themselves, so anxiety, autism, depression. Children might have a developmental delay. So this is where we notice, and you could see in the graphic on the left, this is where we notice issues with language, gross motor skills, fine motor skills, social skills, adaptability, intellectual or ability or cognition, but we don't know yet if those are permanent disabilities or if they're just temporary delays. Sometimes children just need early intervention, and then whatever delay they have is taken care of, and then they move forward at a typical rate with regard to development. And then finally, you might encounter children who are gifted, who have abilities and intellectual capabilities that are higher than is considered to be average. It's important to know that just like behavioral challenges, this is something that you should expect to see if you work with young children or children and humans of any age. So roughly 10 to 12% of the population has a disability, has some sort of special need. So again, if you are teaching a classroom of 20 children, you would expect to see 2+ children in your classroom who have one of the types of exceptionality that we were discussing on the previous 2 slides. So I also wanted to show you what you can kind of expect to see in terms of disability type, what's more common, what's less common. So this is data from 2017 to 2018, and this is showing children who were served under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, ages 3 to 21. So you can see that learning disabilities and speech and language impairments were the most common, followed by health impairments, autism, developmental delay, then intellectual disability, emotional disturbance, and then orthopedic impairment and hearing impairments were less likely. So I think a lot of times we think about children with disabilities as being a child in a wheelchair or a child who has some sort of physical characteristic that provides evidence of the special need that they're experiencing, but that's actually much less likely than some of these other kinds of exceptionality. I also wanted to highlight that over time we do see changes in incident rates, so we see changes in what kinds of disabilities we're seeing. Part of this is medical care or early intervention, so we may see less of something because medical care has gotten better or early intervention corrected an incident of a particular kind of disability before that child ever came to you. And then also sometimes we are just better at diagnosing things. So there is this notion that incidence rates for autism are increasing because we now are better at diagnosing children with autism. We're more likely to call something autism than we were in the past. So it's important to know that things do change over time, so that the kinds of disabilities that we might see over time don't remain stagnant. So you can see that the little arrows to the right of the percentages, you can see those are things that have increased, and then the minus sign in front of the number shows things that have decreased. So, and then things that don't have a minus sign or a percentage sign have relatively remained the same. So in terms of seizures and stuttering, that remained the same between 1997 and 2008, or close enough to the same that it's really not worth commenting on. But autism, you can see, went way up. So the incidence of autism rose almost 300% in those 10 years, whereas hearing loss went down. So we're getting better at identifying hearing loss early on, mitigating that issue, whereas with autism, whether it's due to environmental factors or us just being better at diagnosing it, that went way up, and you're much more likely to see a child with autism in your classroom or in your professional setting. So it's important to pay attention to this kind of data so that we can be ready for these children coming to our classrooms and professional settings, and ways in which we as a community can work to lower incidence rates for particular kinds of disabilities. One of the best ways to satisfy children's curiosity about exceptionality and help them to learn more about people with special needs is to allow them to participate in classrooms that include both children with and without disabilities. It's called inclusive education, and that's what we're going to be focusing on for the rest of this particular lecture. One way to serve young children with special needs is through inclusive education. So inclusive education is bringing in children with special needs and children without special needs and serving them in the same classroom. So it is a classroom that is open to everyone, regardless of ability level. So when we're thinking about inclusive education and serving children with and without special needs, we want to make sure that the types of services provided allow everyone to meet their developmental needs. So children without special needs shouldn't be left behind because the focus is all on children with special needs and vice versa. So we want to make sure that we have a good collaborative team of staff to make inclusive education work and make sure that everyone gets their needs met. You need to have a good team of professionals. So you need to have general education teachers, you need to have special education teachers, therapists such as physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech and language therapists, and then paraprofessionals. Those are individuals who work directly with children with special needs. So perhaps they help them with feeding, or they help them to get into adaptive equipment that they need to use, like a wheelchair or a stander. So it's generally a person who is assigned to a child who has more significant special needs to make sure that they don't get lost in the classroom and that their particular needs aren't going unmet. And then also this allows teachers to focus on all the children rather than needing to focus on those more specialized kinds of needs that a child with a disability might have. So the link on this slide takes you to some resources, but also takes you to a video that I'd like you to watch. It gives a great walkthrough of what inclusive education is. It also gives you a great historical lens on how inclusive education came to be, and talks about the history of inclusive education that I've also provided for you on slides 9 and 10. So as I said on the previous slide, this slide and the next slide have some important historical events that occurred in relationship to the history of inclusive education. So different laws that came into place that provided us with the responsibilities that we now have in a legal sense to children with special needs and when those came about. Some important ones were the 1986 PL 99-457, which extended inclusive education to infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. So that's the law that's directly related to the age group that we're talking about in this particular class. Inclusive education is important to provide because it does have some proven benefits. So you can see that some benefits are listed in the little graphic to the right of the slide, and then I'll just talk briefly about the points listed on the left. So when children with and without disabilities are included in the same classroom, children without disabilities prove to be important models for children with disabilities. So they model ways to play with objects and to interact with other children and to participate in groups and circle times so that children with disabilities can learn by watching and by participating in activities with children who are not experiencing the same delays or disabilities. It helps typically developing children to have greater empathy, to become less fearful. So remember I was talking about in the diversity lecture that we tend to have bias around things that we're not familiar with, we haven't had experience with, we don't understand. And it's the same with interacting with people with disabilities. If this isn't something that you've had experience or practice with, you may have fears and biases towards people who are different from yourself in that way. So it helps to lessen that. There's also some evidence to show that it's important to begin inclusive education early in children's lives. If you wait until children are in elementary school, then many of those biases and fears have already been developed, and then inclusive education may not work as well. So if you start early, it's kind of like also when we talked about when you watch the reject video and they were saying, you know, that you can't say you can't play, it's a good time to start when children are little, because then they'll adopt that mantra for when they're older. But if you wait to say those kinds of things until they're older, they won't be receptive. So it's really important to start inclusive education as early as possible. And then also just structurally, it's a good time. In early childhood education, it tends to be more child-directed, more teacher facilitation. There's lots of different activities to choose from. So children with varying abilities and needs have the opportunity to participate in ways that are meaningful to them, rather than in a more traditional elementary school classroom where everyone's expected to be doing the same thing at the same time. Sometimes it's hard for certain children to participate because that may not be a skill that they have or a goal that they're working on, whereas in early childhood, where there's more opportunities to engage in activities that are personally meaningful, that tends to work better for children of diverse abilities. It's also important to be realistic and realize that there are some barriers. These are not barriers that can't be overcome, but there are considerations that need to be taken into account when deciding whether to provide an inclusive program or not. So on this slide and the next slide, we'll talk about some of those barriers or some of those challenges that need to be met. And one of them, honestly, is just staff attitudes and abilities. So one, a lot of teachers have not been trained to work with children with special needs, so they just may not have the skills and abilities that they need to be able to do that effectively. So that is a problem in and of itself, and then sometimes that problem of not being prepared or being uncertain makes teachers reluctant to have children with special needs in their classroom. So we've got kind of a two-pronged issue. We've got teachers who may not be trained well enough, and then also teachers who, for whatever reason, may be uncomfortable with having children with disabilities in their classroom. So we definitely need to make sure that teachers in their pre-service lives, when they're getting their degrees and their coursework done, that they have coursework related to children with special needs, and they also have opportunities to practice working with children with special needs, so that they can come into their professional lives as prepared as possible. It can also be expensive. A lot of centers and schools and family daycare homes aren't set up to be able to effectively include children with special needs. They may not have playgrounds that are fully accessible. They may not have the specialized staff. They may not have created those collaborations, so they don't have access to paraprofessionals and different kinds of therapists. So that's why it's really important to partner with an agency in your area that serves children with special needs, so you can get plugged into those kinds of support services that will be important. In our area, it's Inland Regional Center, or IRC. So important to get hooked up with that kind of facility so that that piece doesn't become a barrier. And then also making sure that once you have put in that expense and staff are ready, that you really are looking around the environment and making sure that it is truly accessible and that you are willing to do what you need to do to modify things. So putting that money into that playground, looking around the classroom and making sure that tables can be adjusted for a wheelchair to go underneath, or that you are providing instruction that meets a variety of modalities. So you're providing things visually and in an auditory way, and so that we're really thinking about what all of the different needs that children might be bringing into the classroom with them. Without appropriate training and adequate support staff, so paraprofessionals to help children who have feeding issues or adaptive equipment, somebody who is hired to help take care of those kinds of things for that child. Also different kinds of therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech and language therapists. It really can be a challenge to meet the needs of all of the children in the class. If you really don't know what you're doing, if you haven't had good training, more than just one intro to special ed class in college, or again, the adequate support staff. So this really is one of the barriers, but it's workable. When I was a graduate school going to Purdue University in Indiana, we had inclusive programs, and they worked fabulously. And they worked fabulously because we had teachers who were extremely well trained. We worked directly with our local agency. It was called GLASS, Greater Lafayette Area Special Services, and we had a caseworker who was assigned to us to help us think about how to navigate challenges for the children in our classroom, both those with and without disabilities. We also had fabulous support staff. We had a speech and language program at Purdue. The interns would come and work with all of the children in the classroom, not just children with identified speech and language issues. We had access to occupational therapists and physical therapists. Children who needed it had a paraprofessional. So there was one child who had a G-tube to eat, so it's basically a tube that extends into your stomach, and she was there to help monitor making sure that the dressings were clean, keeping that child engaged at snack time because he wasn't able to eat. So that kind of support, and really being a whole system, we were able to more than adequately meet the needs of all of the children in the classroom, both those who were typically developing and those who had special needs. So it is possible, but it does require effort and planning and folks who are able to work together effectively for it to be able to work in the best way possible. A couple points on working with families. It's really important to be sensitive and respectful to families who both have a child with a disability and to families who have a child who does not have a disability. So a couple of things. One, families who have a child with a disability, it's a hard road to toe. Most families want the very best for their children. They weren't planning when they got pregnant to have a child with a disability, so it takes a lot of adjusting. It changes family dynamics and how you thought you were going to be doing things. It's hard to find programs that really understand children with disabilities and have the skills and abilities to work effectively with them. Not all teachers are real enthusiastic, as we talked about in the barriers slide, about having children with disabilities in their classroom. So, you really need to remember to treat not only children with respect, but their families as well. In terms of families who have a child without a disability, unfortunately, not all families are thrilled to have children with disabilities in their child's classroom. So you really have to work carefully and sensitively and thoughtfully with those families to help them understand that this is a benefit both to the child with a disability and to their child who is typically developing. It's really important to help families to see the the pros of inclusive education rather than just the cons, and help to alleviate their fears, because their fear is their child's not going to get everything they need, that child with a disability might do something disruptive or otherwise interfere with their child's learning. So, helping to both educate families and be respectful of their fears and concerns and do your best to alleviate those. Let's wrap up by talking about ways to facilitate inclusion. So once you've gotten around the barriers and realized that it's an important thing to do, what do you need to do to be ready? So one, you need to make sure that you understand the laws and rules and obligations of providing special education to students. So know what those different disability types are that we talked about earlier. Know how to make a referral and work with those agencies like Inland Regional Center. Know what an IFSP and an IEP are. So an IFSP is an individualized family service plan. It outlines goals and objectives for children age 0 to 3, and then an IEP is an individualized education plan, and it is for 3 until children are done with the K through 12 school system, having good collaborative team player skills, knowing signs to look for to be able to identify any issues early on and help families get appropriate resources to make sure they're getting the services that they need. So the link that is in the middle of this page is helping you to understand the difference between an IFSP and an IEP. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. And then another tip is to make sure that you are considering both children who are behind their peers potentially and children who are ahead of their peers. So don't forget to include children who are gifted in some developmental domain. That's also considered to be in the special needs realm. And so you want to make sure that you're including both children. So children who are behind, children who are on time, and children who are ahead. And there are some tips on page 149 in your textbook for helping you to think about how to work with children who are gifted. So a few more ways to help facilitate inclusion. One, like I said, the structure of early childhood programs works very well for providing inclusion because we do things that work for everybody. We do things that work for children who are behind, on time, and ahead in different developmental domains. We incorporate child-initiated activities. We use positive child guidance. We use authentic assessment, which we'll talk more about in our last lecture. And so it's easier to adjust to working with children with special needs when you have more flexibility in the types of programs that you offer. So the YouTube video on this slide is a great example of how we can use good, high quality, developmentally appropriate early childhood programs to meet the needs of all children. You want to make sure that you are really working to encourage peer interactions. Sometimes with children with special needs, we get so focused on what they need cognitively or what they need physically, and we forget that they also need to have interactions with their friends, and they need to learn how to have good, high-quality peer social play kinds of skills. So take a look at the article by NAEYC. It helps to give you some tips about how to create a classroom where all children have social opportunities. And then finally, just to finish up, going back to our diversity lecture when we were talking about anti-bias and we were talking about making sure that if children say something that's inaccurate or unfair or not true, that we address that we don't let biased behaviors of any kind take root in our classrooms. And that also includes working with children with special needs. So if children who are of varying abilities are saying unfriendly, biased things about each other, it's really important to tackle those kinds of things and to learn how to talk with children about disabilities and the varying abilities that all humans have. So the article at the bottom of this page by Baby Center is got some great information about how to talk with children who are typically developing about children with special needs.